And welcome to another live stream. This time our topic is Azure Virtual Desktop, and the format will be basically the same as for our last live stream. That will be me talking, going through a presentation, and then we'll do some demos, Q&A, all that fun jazz. So leave your questions down in the comments and I will get to them in the Q&A part. I would really like it if you actually had some questions, so feel free. But yeah, let's get to it, I guess. So the topic is Azure Virtual Desktop as described, and our short little agenda is then what, how, why, doing some demos, talk about how much, as in, costs, and then the Q&A in the end of the live stream. So let's get cracking, I guess. Let's get to what. What is Azure Virtual Desktop? Well, it's virtual apps and desktops. So yeah, you can publish apps, you can publish desktops, and then your users can consume those, I guess. And these apps are then installed on session hosts or regular VMs. They are called session hosts, but we'll get to that in a minute. And these can be based on Windows 10 or 11, or they can be based on a Windows Server operating system. 2012 R2 and later is the requirements there. Keen observers might notice there is no Linux option here. You can kind of make it happen, but it won't be as good experience as with the Windows-based operating systems. You can, of course, always consume from any operating system that you want, but yeah, you are limited to the Windows 10, 11, and Windows Server operating system. And the fact that you can use a client-based operating system here, like Windows 10 or 11, is really neat because that does give a better user experience for your users because, a lot of stuff doesn't really work that well with a server-based operating system. And Azure Virtual Desktop is, as far as I know, the only place where you can have a client operating system multi-session. So you can have Windows 10 or Windows 11 multi-session. You've had the option to do multi-session on server-based operating system for years and years, but with Azure Virtual Desktop, that was the first time we could do it with a client-based operating system. So that is one of the key benefits of Azure Virtual Desktop, but you can, of course, also do single session if that is what you want. It is as a service, so you pay for the Azure Virtual Desktop service and everything is managed within there, but you need to bring your own session hosts. So we'll get to kind of the segregation of roles here, but for the most part, you pay for a service and then you just bring your own session hosts. And for those familiar with the old RDS setups within Windows, then you probably recognize the session host role. But basically, every other infrastructure role you get as a service handled by Microsoft. So and that ties kind of into how the Azure Virtual Desktop service works. And you have all these roles or responsibilities that you need to, take care of when doing a RDS environment for yourself. So you need to have a gateway, you need to have the web access, you need to have storage, licensing, management tools, images, user profiles, and so on. But since most of the Azure Virtual Desktop service is provided to you as a service, then you don't really have to worry too much about all of these because you have a separation. Some of the things are handled by you, a small amount of the things, and most of it is handled by Microsoft. Now, some of these, paths cross here and there, like the compute part, because yes, you will have to provide your own session hosts, but they will be running in an Azure data center. So some of them cross, but this is the basic idea of how the responsibility is split up in the Azure Virtual Desktop service. So the infrastructure parts, that's handled by Microsoft. Gateway role, the web access role, connection broker, the license broker, the load balancing, and the management tools are all handled by Microsoft, and you don't really have to worry about them. They will be there and working and scale to your needs. What you do need to handle is the session hosts and the identity. Those things are something you need to handle and provide. And the session host is basically the workhorse in this kind of setup. This is where the published apps are running. So this would be if you, for example, use a published app and run Word as a published app on your end user device, then that application isn't running on that end user device, it's running on the session host. So that's what the session host is. But there are also different kinds of ways of handling identity up in all of this. You do need Azure AD, so you need to have user accounts in Azure AD. But you can also opt to bring your Active Directory identities within this. So if you have a working Active Directory, you can bring those identities and use them in Azure Virtual Desktop as well. Of course, if you have them synced to Azure AD. Now, you can also make use of the Azure AD Domain Services role if you want the Active Directory benefits in this kind of a setup, but you already are, all Azure AD. So you can use Azure AD identities, you can use Active Directory identities synced to Azure AD, and you can use Azure AD Domain Services in order to, provide the identity to this service. And regarding identities, there's a bit complicated authentication flow, which can be, confusing at first, because you, or your user, sign into the Azure Virtual Desktop service with their Azure AD accounts. But when they fire up a published app or a published desktop, then they, at least with the default settings, sign into that session host. So for the example with the Active Directory, you would then sign in with your Active Directory account on the session host. But that works well and all. But if you are using Azure AD joint session hosts, then you can get some issues around things like MFA, for example. If, for example, you have legacy MFA enabled, or you have conditional access, but you haven't excluded the VM user sign-in app, then the user will log into the Azure Virtual Desktop service, all fine. They will be prompted for MFA and all that. But once they log into their session host, or rather try to log in, then MFA isn't supported, and the authentication will fail there, unless you not use the default settings. So it's good to have a grasp of how the authentication flow works within Azure AD, within Azure Virtual Desktop, because that could cause some confusion. And Azure Virtual Desktop can be set up in really simple scenarios like this one. Here you have just a couple of session hosts in a VNet. These are then Azure AD joined. So they will be communicating with the Azure Virtual Desktop control plane, which contains all of the magic bits and pieces of Azure Virtual Desktop. I've written down the web access, the gateway, the broker, diagnostics, and REST API. But really, all the magic around Azure Virtual Desktop, all the infrastructure parts that I mentioned earlier, is running within the Azure Virtual Desktop control plane. So the session host will be communicating with the control plane, but when you, as an end user, on the right side on this drawing, connect to the Azure Virtual Desktop service, you are using your Azure AD account and signing in with that. So the authentication is based on Azure AD. So that means that any identity protection measures that you have in place, like MFA, like conditional access, like identity protection, and so on, will be in play, and protecting the identities. And then the Azure Virtual Desktop control plane will then communicate back with the session hosts. So your session hosts are never really exposed to public internet, which is also a huge benefit in this kind of setup. So this is a simple scenario. A bit more complex scenario is this one, where you have session hosts and you have some profile storage we have Azure AD domain services, and so on. So let me quickly just run through this setup here. You have these session hosts that are also making use of a storage account for profile storage, which is important because when you have multiple session hosts, you are not guaranteed that your user will be signed into the same session host each and every time. So if they sign in and customize their setup and add some files locally or something like that, and then the next time they log in, they get signed into a different session host, then, all those changes will be gone. But using a profile storage, like a storage account with Azure Files, FS Logics, and all that fun jazz, then they will have one central user profile that will then be connected to the session host they are logging onto. So in this kind of scenario, we are using FS Logics to store our users' profiles. The session hosts are not joined to Azure AD. They are joined to the Azure AD domain services Active Directory domain. And furthermore, you can see that we have like a virtual network gateway in the hub network here. This virtual network gateway can then be connected to an express route, for example. So connecting back to your on-prem environment. And by that, you can use the session host to access resources on your on-prem environment. But other than that, from the control plane and out, everything is still the same as it were in the last scenario. So this kind of just exemplifies how Azure Virtual Desktop can be in a simple scenario and a bit more complex scenario. This is by no means the most complex you can do, but it is a decent example. So moving on to the why section. Why should we care about Azure Virtual Desktop? Well, apart from the cool tech, of course, you have a huge amount of flexibility. The Azure Virtual Desktop is highly customizable in how you want to set it up and how you want to use it, meaning that it can cover a bunch of different use cases. So it is really, really flexible, but it is also really, really scalable. So this is both in terms of scaling up and down and out and back in. But keep in mind that the control plane that we discussed is handled by Microsoft, and the scaling there is done by them. So the control plane, where you had like the connection broker, the load balancing, and all that, that is always going to be scaled to your needs, always going to be ready for you. But the session hosts part, for example, is something you need to worry about the scaling, but you can do it any way you want. If you want to scale up and down, meaning changing sizes of your session hosts to a beefy one when you have a high amount of usage, and then back down to something smaller when there's not a lot of usage, then you can do that. But you can also scale out and have multiple session hosts and then scale back in once you don't have that same kind of need. And the neat thing is that this can all be done automatically for you. So say, for example, well, at least the scaling out and back in part. So say, for example, you want to scale out when the work hours start. So 7 a.m., that's when people start to connect and need session hosts to be available. Well, then you can scale out. And then once the workday is done, you can scale back in order to, for example, save on cost. So scalability of Azure Virtual Desktop is really, really huge. Not to mention the fact that you can also stack multiple users on a single session host, which is a neat feature. It allows also for offloading of heavy tasks. So say, for example, you need to run regularly a heavy task on your local device, which hogs up all the resources, making you unable to work at the same time as that task is running. Then you can offload that task and run it as a published app or in a published desktop or what have you. And the task can be completed there while you continue to work on your local device. So say, for example, you are editing video or doing 3D renderings. Then you can do all the work, but when the time comes to do the final render, you can do that in the session host or the published app, the published desktop, meaning you can continue to work instead of, just sitting around twiddling your thumbs. So that's one really cool use case for Azure Virtual Desktop. But it also allows for, running Windows-based apps on Mac OS, for example. So if you need Visio, but you're using a Mac, well, then you can use Azure Virtual Desktop to publish that app to your Mac. So yeah, that's also something that ties within the BYOD, bring your own device. And since all the things are happening within the session host, that's the only devices that you as an organization need to worry about. So you can make sure that your session hosts are secure and managed and patched and all that, but it takes the pain away of having to worry about the end user's devices. And furthermore, they can use whatever they want. So if you have someone who really has a need to use Linux, for example, then they can continue to use Linux because everything corporate-wise is within that session host, and they connect to it through the Azure Virtual Desktop. So, using a service like this, then the end user's devices doesn't really matter anymore. And the costs is also a part of what is flexible with Azure Virtual Desktop, because, like I said, you can scale out and in and up and down, thus managing your costs quite a lot. But meaning that, but since the session hosts are basically Azure VMs, you can also make use of other cost lowering features like reserved instance. So you can manage to cut down costs quite a lot by taking some cost effective measures. So yeah, it's flexible also in terms of cost. This kind of topic also kind of ties in with the bring your own device, but seeing if you have a Azure Virtual Desktop environment ready to go and you do a new hire, for example, all they really need is their identity, because you've already provided everything else. So as soon as they have the user account, they can log into the Azure Virtual Desktop service and begin working without the hassle of waiting for a laptop to be installed and configured and maintained by the IT department. They will simply log into a browser, for example, on some random computer and access Azure Virtual Desktop, and they can begin to start working. Well, it's not a given that they actually will, but at least they have the options to do so. And this also works in where you hire consultants, for example. They don't have to have their own laptop. They don't need to configure their laptops. They can just log into Azure Virtual Desktop and start working. And these are some of my reasons as to why you should consider Azure Virtual Desktop. It won't be the perfect fit in each and every scenario, but I feel like you should at least have Azure Virtual Desktop in the back of your head when you're considering different scenarios and different setups. There are also more reasons and use cases than these. For example, you can use Azure Virtual Desktop as a starting point for your movement from on-prem to Azure, for example, because say you move the workspace for your users to Azure Virtual Desktop first, meaning instead of using local apps and local infrastructure to work, they will use the Azure Virtual Desktop to connect to your on-prem servers. Then you can, move one server at a time, one system at a time at your own pace without the users actually noticing anything different, because they are already using Azure Virtual Desktop as their, way into your setup. But yeah, enough talk for now. Let us do some demos. So this is not going to be like a complete overview, complete breakdown of every bit and piece of Azure Virtual Desktop, but it's going to be a brief overview of how Azure Virtual Desktop works and what you can do with it. So this is in the Azure Virtual Desktop parts of the Azure portal, and the first thing you see here is Petter, create a host pool. And that's important because, that's the basics of the Azure Virtual Desktop service. You need a host pool to have your session hosts in, which you then can use to, provide apps and desktops from. So, considering that, let's start by checking out the host pools. So I have provided two different host pools here. I have one containing session hosts that are Azure AD joined, and I have one containing session hosts that are AD joined. So I have the HP AAD 01 here, which is the Azure AD joined one, and I have the HP AD 01, which are the the Active Directory joined ones. So if we take a look at the Azure AD 01 here, and the overview gives you a decent look of how the host pool is performing and how it's set up. You see that I have two machines, of which one is available. Machines in this case is the session hosts. You can see how many sessions there are, how many application groups, which we'll get to in a bit, applications, and so on. And since scaling was a thing I talked a whole lot about, let's check out the scaling plans. In my case here, I have set up a scaling plan for the weekdays and enable this on the host pool, meaning that this scaling plan here will apply to the host pool and the session host with it. So if I click on this and check out the settings on it, if you go to the schedules, we can see that I have a weekdays schedule that runs Monday through Friday. And if we click that as well, you can see this is actually the same wizard that you go through when creating a new scaling plan. So it's kind of a neat example. You see the time zone, which this is for or using, because we will get to some times in terms of when it's scaling up and down and so on. So time zone is important, because otherwise, you could end up in a case where you're scaling up in the middle of the night and scaling down in the middle of the workday, which would be a bad situation. So you have the name and you have which days to repeat the schedule on. So in my case, I have done nothing on the Saturday and Sunday. So this scaling plan will only apply Monday through Friday. Hitting next is the ramp up section of this schedule. This is where the scaling plan will begin to power on more session hosts. And in my case, the start time is 7 a.m., meaning that on 7, as the clock reaches 7 a.m., I will switch to the load balancing algorithm of depth first. This means that the Azure Virtual Desktop service will try to fill up each session host before assigning users to a new one, as opposed to the breadth first, which will try to spread out your users as thinly as possible across the highest amount of session hosts it can do. So in my case here, I am depth first. I have a minimum percentage of hosts at 20, meaning that at 7 a.m., at least 20% of the session hosts in the host pool this is assigned to should be running and available. So say, for example, you have 10 session hosts in a host pool. This would then mean that at least 2 of them should be online at 7 a.m. And the capacity threshold here is at which point should new session hosts be powered on. And powered on is actually a keyword here, because you need to have your session hosts provisioned and working, because the scaling plan doesn't create new session hosts for you. It will only power on or off any existing session hosts. So keep that in mind. The capacity threshold is if you have a user limit of, say, 10 users per session host. If that 6th user then logs in, then it will fire up a new session host, because that session host is then considered full. So back to the example of 10 session hosts in a host pool, they should be at least 2 of them running at 7 a.m. and they should not be fuller than 60%. And furthermore, we have the peak hours, which is, it kind of like the name implies, it's the peak hours where you have the most amount of usage of your system. In my case, it starts at 9 a.m. and still we will use the depth first. Now, in this scenario, it would be actually a good thing to use the breadth first, because this is where you have the most amount of users, and if you want to provide them with the best possible experience, then you should have as few users and sessions active at the same time as possible. So in my case, I have the depth first, but do consider to have the breadth first during your peak hours. Then we have the ramp down. This is when the scaling plan should start to power off session host in order to cut down on your costs. So at 4 p.m. I will be in this case still using the depth first, but this would be when you switch from breadth first to depth first, for example. And at this point, I only need 10% of my session hosts running as a minimum. So, back to the example of 10 session hosts in the host pool, that would be that would mean that one should be running at all times. And now the capacity threshold is also set to 90%. So in this case, the session host should be rather full before it fires up a new session host. You can also have the option to force log off your users, and this is kind of important because if you have breadth first, for example, and spread your users thinly across all of your session hosts, then if you don't force them to log off, then they will be still signed in to the session host, and the session host will not be powered off, meaning that you will still have as many session hosts running as you had during your peak hours, for example. So do select yes on the force log off users, but then again, also set up a decent delay time before actually logging them off. The delay time here, in my case 30 minutes, is the time between they send the notification message that we have down here and they are forced to log off. So at 4 p.m. in my case, I will begin to scale down my environment, and the users will get a notification saying that scaling down due to end of work hours. You will be logged off in 30 minutes. Make sure to save your work. And then 30 minutes after that, the system will start to force log off your users, or my users rather. So this is the ramp down, and then you have the off-peak hours. In my case, this starts at 6 p.m. and that switches the load balancing algorithm to depth first, if it at any point was breadth first. So this is when I expect there to be low load on my Azure Virtual Desktop environment. And also notice that this is a start time and not an end time. So in my case, where I have this schedule running Monday through Friday, this will be then at 6 p.m. on Friday, the off-peak hours begins, and they will then last up until the ramp up start time on Monday. So meaning that off-peak hours will be from Friday at 6 p.m. until Monday at 7 a.m. in my case. And of course then every night in between the weekdays as well. So that's the scaling plan. It works really nice, and is also the reason why you can see in my host pool that I have one unavailable session host, because the scaling plan has turned that one off. And then we have the RDP properties. And if you've ever tried to edit an RDP file within Notepad, for example, you will notice a few similarities here, at least when we come to the advanced part. But this has a couple of different tabs. I will not be going into detail of each and every one of them, but I want to highlight a couple, like the Azure AD authentication. This is not the default setting. The default setting, I believe, is not configured. But I mentioned previously that if you have Azure AD joined session hosts and don't enable Azure AD authentication, then you can run into issues if you are, for example, using conditional access and not have excluded the Azure VM sign-in application, because if the Azure AD authentication is not enabled, then when your users are signing into the session host, meaning firing up a published app or a published desktop, the authentication will go to that local session host, which then in turn will try to authenticate with Azure AD. And in doing so, the MFA part is not supported. So if you have then a conditional access policy requiring MFA, then the authentication will break and your users will be unable to sign in with a pretty generic wrong username and password error message. So that can be really tough to troubleshoot. Make sure that you have Azure AD authentication enabled and set it to RDP will attempt to use Azure AD authentication to sign in. We also have session behavior. Do you want to enable or disable reconnects, for example, and bandwidth auto detect? This is where you configure that. Device redirection is important for one of the use cases for Azure Virtual Device redirection is important for one of the use cases for Azure Virtual Desktop, which I didn't mention earlier, and that is if you want to use Azure Virtual Desktop as a gateway into a locked down environment. Because if you have like a locked down environment, you can set up Azure Virtual Desktop within that environment, and it's going to be a rather safe jump host because the connection from the session host goes out to the control plane and the session hosts themselves are not directly exposed. So using Azure Virtual Desktop as a locked down jump host system is really good, but then you should also consider all the device redirection here, like turning off audio output on the local device, local in this case meaning your end user's device. For example, disable redirection of drives, the clipboard, and so on. If you use Azure Virtual Desktop for a locked environment, this is where you should configure a lot of stuff. But also keep in mind that you have features like the screen capture protection and the watermarking feature of Azure Virtual Desktop will also help if you are using Azure Virtual Desktop in a locked down environment. Screen capture protection will block the ability to do screen captures from the local device, and the watermarking feature will add watermarks to the session. So if there's a screen grab or leak of some kind, you can trace it back to where the session that it originates from. I do have a video on it if you want to check that out later on. And of course, the display settings here is where you enable multiple displays, or you can also set a specific size if you want. I would recommend you leave these at default because the user can themselves in the client override these default settings and do what they want. Enable multiple display support. What that does is once a user fires up a desktop, that desktop will cover all of their monitors. Not everyone wants that. Some people want that, but train your users so that they know they can change this setting in their local client as well. So, they have at least have a choice. The last here is the advanced. And basically this text box here is a summary of all the other settings that were done on the other tabs, but you have some more options as well. A good example is, for example, the enable RDS AAD auth is 1, meaning it's enabled. And this advanced tab is often used when Microsoft releases new features for Azure Virtual Desktop. They are often available for you to specify here before they are available as a selection in the other tabs here. So that's a likely scenario where you will be using the advanced tab. Other than that, basically just use the tabs and do your selections there. And moving on to the properties over our host pool, there's at least one thing to keep in mind here, and that is the Start VM on Connect. Because, like I said, you have the option to scale automatically up and down, but in smaller setups where perhaps you only have one session host, then you can actually turn that one off and then have no session hosts running, and then enable the Start VM on Connect, meaning that if Azure Virtual Desktops detects a user trying to log on and that there is no session host available, it will power on that VM. So that's a really neat feature for smaller environments. Just keep in mind that it also requires you to give the Azure Virtual Desktop service or app registration the permissions to power on VMs. The validation environment setting here is, basically if you want to be a beta user or not. So the session host will have, for example, an agent installed on them. That they will have that. That's a fact. But the updates to those agents will be, production ready. But if you want, or rather, if you enable the validation environment, then any near production versions of those agents will be pushed out to your session host, and you also get the option to use some newer features or public preview features, for example. So validation environments is not something you enable on your host pool in a production environment unless you really need a specific feature that is only available for validation environments. But then do also keep in mind that you are like a beta tester for Microsoft in that case. The properties is also where you select the default load balancing algorithm for your host pool. In my case, it's depth first. This is where you could select the breadth first, but then again, the scaling plan can adjust this according to your schedule. And also you have the max session limit, which is how many sessions are there room for before a session host is considered full. Right, so quickly mentioning the networking here. This is where Private Link will be living once it's out of public preview. So if you want private endpoints with your Azure Virtual Desktop setup, this is where you would configure that. You can also join the public preview, but if I remember correctly, this requires you to re-register the Azure Virtual Desktop provider, so it will potentially break any Azure Virtual Desktop environments you have running as of now. So if you have any production Azure Virtual Desktops, then wait for the GA of private endpoints. I mentioned the agents on your session hosts. They will have updates at given intervals when Microsoft sees fit, but you can also schedule them if you so want. So if you enable the schedule agent updates, you can select a maintenance window for your session host, and within that time slot, the updates to the agents will be installed, as opposed to, when Microsoft sees fit. And then we have the session hosts. I've mentioned them so many times, but this is the overview of the session host in my Azure AD joint host pool. As you can see, I have one that is available and one that is unavailable. I have one that has 2 sessions on it, and the other one has none since it is unavailable. If I, for example, click on this session host, then you can see some basic information and some checks. You can enable drain mode, and what this is that it doesn't throw users out or force them to log off, but it will not enable any new users to log in to that session hosts, which is a more pleasant way, I guess, of draining your session hosts and making them available for, maintenance and stuff like that. You also have the users tab here, which will show you all the users that are currently signed in, or at least have a session on your session host, and selecting one of them, you can then notify them, log off, or force log off them as well. And if you want, you can click the name here, and then you will be brought to the standard VM management of, a regular old Azure VM, because this session host is a regular old Azure VM, and you get all the other kinds of management as you do with a regular VM from here. So, going back to the main page of Azure Virtual Desktop, you also have application groups here. And in my case, you see that I have 4. I have two desktop application groups. That's one for each of my host pools. And I have 2 remote app application groups, also one for each of my host pools in this case. You can have multiple remote app application groups, but you can only have one desktop application group per host pool. And the application groups is, well, as the name implies, they contain applications or desktops in the matter of the desktop application group. So if I go into the Azure AD app group here, you see that I have 2 applications and I have 1 assignment. And if I go to applications here, you can see the applications that this application group is, supplying to any users assigned to this application group. And one way to add applications here, which is really, really nice, is if I click Add, I can select Application Source Start Menu. This actually brings in the start menu of my session host, and I can select an application from that start menu. So if I, for example, want to publish the what should we do? Should we do Excel? Let's do Excel. And then I'll hit save. Then any users assigned to this application group will have access to that Excel application. And the assignments, I can check here. In my case, it's only Petter Hybrid that has been assigned to this application group, but that also means that he has now access to these 3 applications. I would recommend using groups instead of specific users, but your mileage may vary. And the final thing I wanted to show here for now is the workspaces. And this is, how should I put it? It will probably make more sense once I jump to the client a bit later on, but if we're going into this, you can see that you have some applications group contained within this workspace, and the workspace is basically what's presented to your users. I said that the application groups is where you assign access, but then the workspace is how it's presented to your users. So that's shortly what the workspace is. I'll go into a bit more detail on it later on. Do want to mention the properties and the friendly name here if you want to give it a better name for your users other than WS AVD Live 01. And before we jump to the client side of things, let's also take a look at monitoring and insights. So if I click on the insights here, you have a huge amount of data available for you to either troubleshoot or get a view of how your environment is performing. This is based on log analytics, so you would need to configure your host pools and your session host and all that to send data to that log analytics workspace. I'll show you how in a minute, but that also means that in terms of costs, this is another one that you have to keep in mind, because the data that the session host and the host pools and so on put into that log analytics do have a cost associated with them. So within this insights here, you select the resource group and the host pool and so on, and you get some basic information here, connection diagnostics and so on, which is also all pretty neat. One thing that is cool is the connection diagnostics, which does, at the default setting, give you a good feeling of the how connections are performing. Do they succeed? Do they fail? And so on. But this button here with the focus on failures is really neat in a troubleshooting scenario because, it focuses on failures. So with this set to yes, then all of these boxes are focusing on all failed attempts, failed connection attempts, and so on, meaning that it's a bit easier to actually drill down and find out why was a connection failed. So if we go to a user, for example, this one here, you see that it did fail on the logon. Scrolling down, you can see that is an authentication logon failure. In this case, I know for a fact that it was due to the fact that legacy MFA was enabled, meaning, as I discussed earlier, that authentication to that Azure AD joint session host, then to Azure AD, failed because of the MFA not being supported. So this is the kind of error message you would see in your logs if that were the case. And furthermore, here you have connection performance to view round trip time and stuff like that. You have host performance. Utilization is a really good thing to see. Are my session hosts overpowered? Are they underpowered? Do I have enough session hosts for my amount of users, and so on? And of course, also you have stuff like alerts, if you have any alerts triggered in your Azure Virtual Desktop. So the insights here is really, really powerful, given that you make use of it. So you configure this by using the workbooks here, and then you have the check configuration. And then let's scroll down to the top. You select a resource group and a host pool, and optionally also the log analytics workspace. Now in my case, all of my host pools are already sending their diagnostics data to log analytics. But if that wasn't the case, I would have a button here simply stating, enable configure this host pool to send diagnostic data. I can't remember the exact phrasing on the button, but it's basically one button and then deploy, and it's done. It's really, really simple to onboard your host pools and your session hosts and all that to log analytics and start using this insights feature. And another neat thing about this one is the data generated, where you can see the data that is being sent into your log analytics, because as I said, that does have a cost associated with it. So that's also a good thing to have a good view on. This gives you just how much data has been consumed by your log analytics. Yeah, should we jump actually over to our client? So let us see here. If we go like that, I have a client here. Let's see if I can log in. Oh, come on. There we are. I have installed the remote desktop client here. And you can see that I have the WS AVD Live 01. That is the workspace that I mentioned. So these are all from different application groups, but they are presented as a whole from that workspace. So that is why you should, set up a good friendly name, for example, to your workspaces. So that's what I meant about it making more sense once I got to the client side of things. Now, in my case, you see that I have published 3 different apps and I have a couple of desktops, but we don't see Excel yet, which we did, assign to me. So if I click the ellipsis here and then do refresh, then it should pop up in a minute or two. There we are. There we can also see the Excel application as a published app. And the neat thing is that all of these published apps are also automatically placed in the start menu. So if I click the start menu and then search for Excel, for example, you see that I have both the locally installed Excel app and you have the one that is provided through Azure Virtual Desktop here. And firing that up, you can see how that looks. Let us just give it a minute or two. And I'll make sure to do some water in the meantime. Right, so now I have Excel running as a published app from my Azure Virtual Desktop, and it doesn't really, the look and feel is as if it was locally installed for the most part. Like I can move it around, I can snap it to the end of the screen, I can maximize it, and so on. So the user experience in this case is pretty neat, and the only really way you can tell that it's running as a published app is that little remote app icon on the start menu here, or the taskbar rather. So this is how it looks from a user's perspective. I do want to do one more test, and that is through the desktop, because I should probably show you how the desktops works as well. So let's try to sign into my desktop now. And the Azure Virtual Desktop pretty much shares the same control plane as Windows 365. If you watched any of my Windows 365 videos, then you know that the user experience in terms of like meetings and stuff is actually pretty good right out of the box. And so should also be the case for Azure Virtual Desktop. So let us just fire up Teams. I should see if I have a meeting somewhere here. Yes. So I can join that. And you see that I do have the local devices from my local device. I have the audio devices that I have locally. I have the camera and so on. Let's do a mute here and then do join and see how that works. I do have a cell phone mounted right up here with which should be joined to the meeting. I don't know why it isn't. Let us check that as well. Let us see. Let's do. Yeah, the demo gods are not with us today, so that was a shame. Yeah, sorry about that, but this was supposed to be a demo showing how really magnificent the meeting experience is within a Teams running within Azure Virtual Desktop. But it is what it is. Today it wasn't working, so let us skip that for now. And then that was it for the client side of things. So I think we actually should be going back to. Let me just organize my stuff here to the presentation, because it is time to discuss the elephant in the room, how much, because that's also always a question with Microsoft services. How much does it actually cost? And with Azure Virtual Desktop, it's actually twofold. It is licenses, and then you have consumption. So in terms of licensing, if you are using a server-based operating system, then you need to have RDS CALs with software assurance, or you need to have RDS user subscriptions. And if I remember correctly, the RDS user subscriptions are only available through CSP. So if you don't already have a relationship with a CSP partner, then you would need to have that as well. So, but we want to use a client operating system, and with the client operating system, the licenses also changes. These are the licenses you can use, but to put it really short, you need a license that includes Windows. So as you can see, that would be Microsoft 365 E3, Business Premium, A5, a lot of different licenses. And so as long as they include Windows, you should be good to go. But there is also a third option around licenses, and that is the per user licensing. This is only available for external user accounts. So, guest accounts in your Azure AD, for example, they can be licensed for Azure Virtual Desktop per user, and that would entail a $10 for the desktop published desktops and $5.50 for published apps. But again, this is only for external users, but it is nice to know that that is actually a feature that you can make use of, assigning AVD access to external users. Now, for the consumption part, this is largely only for your session hosts and the costs around them. You have the compute cost for them, you have the storage cost for them, and you have networking cost for them. But also, if you, like in the complex scenario, use a storage account for central storage of user profiles, then that would also incur some costs. So consumption in this matter is basically everything around your VMs and the storage around them, but also the networking, egress traffic from your VNet. So, yeah, the costs of Azure Virtual Desktop is for licenses, and you have consumption as well. And with that, we are actually over in the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, post them in the chat and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. I have a question. How does it compare to Windows 365? And I think I mentioned it a couple of times, or a time or two, but it uses much of the same control plane as Windows 365. So Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 is what I like to call sister technologies. They share a lot of the same features, and a lot of new features will be either coming to AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, and then to Windows 365 like a week or two later, or the other way around. But I think the key differences is well described by Microsoft, that Azure Virtual Desktop is designed for flexibility, while Windows 365 is optimized for simplicity. So if you want something really simple, that's Windows 365. If you want something that's flexible and customizable to your needs, then that's Azure Virtual Desktop. Also keep in mind that Windows 365 is both simple to set up and to, cost manage, because we saw that the Azure Virtual Desktop, that has the licenses and the consumption, that's the costs for it. But when Windows 365, you basically pay one license and get one cloud PC, and that's the cost of it. So I don't know if that was a good answer to the question, but it was at least an answer. Does it work with the Azure AD Domain Services service? Well, yeah, it really does. It does it so well. Actually, back when Azure Virtual Desktop first was launched, back when it was called the Windows Virtual Desktop, it didn't have the support for Azure AD Joint Session Host. So Azure AD Domain Services was really the only choice for those businesses that were all cloud, which only had Azure AD user accounts and not any AD. So yeah, it works pretty awesome with Azure AD Domain Services as well. And there doesn't seem to be any more of them. So yeah, feel free to contact me afterwards. Comment on the video. The recording will be here. Tweet at me. Anyone wants ask questions, I'll try and answer them as best as I can. And yeah, thanks for sticking around, and cheers.